evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cambridge Union Society. There are a few brief announcements before we start tonight. There are to be no cameras, no phones, and no recording of any kind, either oral or visual. Please remain in your seats at all times until the end of the talk and questions. And finally, any disruption of the event is in violation of the Union's constitution as set out in both your membership and your ticket. If you attempt to disrupt this event, you will be asked to leave immediately and subject to a number of potential penalties, including revocation of membership. Dominique Strauss-Kahn is a French economist and politician. He served as the managing director of the International Monetary Fund from 2007 to 2011, having previously been a professor of economics at Sciences Po and the French Minister of Economy and Finance. He will be speaking on the global financial climate and, in particular, globalization and the Eurozone. Please join me in welcoming Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
Well, thank you. I want first to thank all of you for having invited me, and especially Cathy Lamb and the Standing Committee of the Cambridge Union Society. I understand it creates some emotion, which I'm very sorry about, and I hope that you will not keep me responsible for the noise. I have been asked, and I'm happy to talk to you about globalization and the Eurozone, and I decided to do so through using a tale of three trilemmas. Policy trilemmas have always been a very potent way to describe the economic policy trade-off, and some trilemmas are especially powerful to understand our current predicament and our future challenges. So I will present three of them, which I found particularly useful to understand the world economy these days and to provide hints for solution. These three trilemmas are totally independent from each other, but in another way they're deeply interconnected, and I think it's useful to think of them concurrently as a system. The first one is very well known by economists, and especially international economists. Maybe there's some among you. It's known since the beginning of the 60s as the Mundell-Fleming one. It has always been a very important reference for international economists. And the idea is the following. It posits that an economy cannot simultaneously have an independent monetary policy and the open current account, a capital account. The capital account is the account where you have inflows and outflows of capital, and a fixed exchange rate. You have to choose. You can have two of them, whatever the one you choose, but you cannot have the three of them. That's the trilemma. And this idea has been the key justification for liberalization of capital movement, telling the countries, accept the flexibility of your exchange rate, and then you have to open your capital account, because if not, you won't be able to have an independent monetary policy. So you have to choose the three. It has also a lot of important consequences for the international monetary system, which, as you know, evolved gradually after the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement to a kind of a non-system, loosely governed by an implicit anchor, namely the US dollar, and the supposed disciplining and the stabilizing effect of these flexible exchange rates and free movement of capital. What we found out subsequently, and I must say painfully from the end of the 90s until now, is that these stabilizing features of this non-system were much weaker than initially thought. And there are many reasons for that. Some at the micro level. I will not spend too much time on this. namely that we don't understand very well the imperfect nature of financial market, also our underestimation of the consequences of financial friction, our deliberate dismissal of the impact of asset bubbles, as you have seen in many countries like Spain with the housing market recently, and, if I may use a barbaric word, our disregard for behavioral macroeconomics, as if macroeconomic was just technique and no behavior, no human behavior in this. But at this micro reason, there are other reasons, macro reasons, which are, in my view, at the same time, simpler and more important. The idea was that on the paper, you have a stabilizing system if it's what the economists call general equilibrium. It means that it has to be applied internationally and systematically, and then it works. The problem is that it didn't happen. And part of the world, and not a small part of the world, China, India, half of the population of the world, and also the most dynamic economies, didn't follow the rule, at least didn't say it's correct rules. When I say didn't follow the rules, as if they were cheating. I'm not saying that. I say they didn't accept this kind of system. So what we fail to acknowledge is that the large part of the world refused to adopt this model. The model would have worked if everybody played the same game, but for a reason, bad or wrong, a large part of the world decided not to do this. And the contradiction between this theory of the international monetary system, flexible exchange rate, open capital accounts, and independent monetary policy, the contradiction between this and the reality has been one of the main sources of instability, and today justifies a profound reform. This has been the subject of a large amount of research over years. The main point being this underlying assumption that there was a consensus to go in this direction, while this consensus didn't exist. It was the consensus proposed by advanced economies, but most emerging economies were not part of the consensus. It just didn't accept the idea that they had to go on with what has been decided by the advanced economies. So the consensus never happened, but we behaved as if there was a consensus. And even after the Asian crisis, some of you may remember the Asian crisis at the end of the 90s, when the Asian crisis has been fixed, it was obvious that most Asian countries will not follow this track. They will follow another track with fixed exchange rate, which has advantages and drawbacks. We may discuss hours about that. What the point is, they didn't follow the track which was prepared as the only one which goes on with globalization. And again, we act as if the system, the plan worked, and the things goes on. So today, we need to accept to look at the world not only with our own glasses, but with the glasses of everybody. And obviously, the consensus is still lacking. There's a consensus on some part of international economics and this Mundell-Fleming trilemma, but not everything. The consensus exists on one thing first. I will quote two. One is that one currency, and especially a currency of a country, the economy of which is likely to become relatively less prominent, is not an optimal solution. And you cannot rely for the world economy only on one currency being the anchor. So it calls either for another currency to be the anchor, but frankly, nobody sees who could replace the dollar. And the idea that the renminbi, the Chinese renminbi, could do this, I don't know what's going to happen in 2 centuries from now, but it's obviously not relevant for today. Or you can go to a new, truly multi-currency system, but then it means that part of the anchors are certainly the dollar, but also the euro, also the renminbi, let's say maybe the pound, maybe the yen, and it's a multi-system, that it means that everybody accepts that it's only part of the system. Or there's a third solution, of course, which is a bit idealistic, which is the very well-known old solution by Keynes, the Bankor, which he proposed at the end of World War II, which was only one currency for everybody, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. Some people say, maybe you have read this, that the SDR, the special drawing rights, which are created by the IMF, could become this special currency. There's certainly a bigger role to play for the SDRs, and if you want me to answer a question about this later on, I will do it with pleasure. But as it stands, the SDR are not really a currency, and it's a kind of a dream to believe that the SDR could replace and become this international currency. So, back to reality, if be based on the dollar only is not a good solution, then we need to go to the only thing which is practical, which is this kind of set of 5, 6, 4, I don't know, international currency that will work together. The other thing on which there is a consensus is that the crisis has shown that our international safety nets don't work very well. What's international safety net? That's the way the international community has organized itself to try to help countries having troubles. And the IMF, of course, is part of it. It has evolved a lot during the crisis, and the IMF has changed a lot his toolkit. Nevertheless, it's not really what we need now, for one main reason, which is that all this rests also on a very strong regional pillar. And the European crisis, for instance, shows us. The IMF, multilateral institution, is working with the European Union or the Commission, which is the regional institution. Could be the same thing in Asia with what is called the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is a kind of pooling of reserves by Asian countries. The problem is that, let's be candid, it doesn't work very well. First, because it's the first time with the European Union that the IMF really has to deal with a regional entity. Obviously, it has to do it, but how to do it? That's not obvious. And even worse, when the European countries, the EU countries, have designed a new system, you know, the European Safety Mechanism, the ESM, nothing has been really prepared to coordinate the work with multilateral institutions like the IMF. So it remains a kind of a fuzzy relationship, as if what is called a troika, you heard about a troika, works always very well. The troika is one guy from the Commission, the European Commission, one guy from the European Central Bank, one guy from the IMF. And those three guys, or ladies, together goes to the country, and it was the case for Greece, for Ireland, for Portugal. The problem is that we cannot act as if they were always in agreement. They're not. So you need a mechanism to resolve the conflicts. Unless you have this, you have a bad practice and bad solution. And that's exactly the situation where we are. So the second consensus is that we need a relationship, a stronger relationship between multilateral institutions like the IMF to solve crisis and regional institutions, but frankly, we don't have it. This leads me to the second trilemma. We don't have it because the legitimacy of different parts of the Troika is not the same. One is an international institution, IMF. Another one is a central bank. The third one is a more political body. The Commission, and the guy working for the Commission, in some respects, is accountable to the European Parliament. So they're different kind of animals. And that leads me to the second trilemma, which I would like to present, and is that of Danny Roderick. He wrote this in 2011, so it's very recent, but it's very powerful. It departs from pure economic theory and connects economics to politics. What Roderick argues is that you cannot have simultaneously, again a trilemma, self-national determination, which means sovereign nation states, democratic governments, and deep global economic integration. You cannot have together sovereignty, integration, and democracy. You can have sovereignty and integration, but then no democracy. It has to be imposed to the people. Or you can have sovereignty and democracy, but then it won't go to globalization, and you can flip it the way you want. So Roderick, which always has been very doubtful about the benefit of hyper-globalization, has very strong and subtle and powerful arguments. And it leads to a very important question, which is the degree of globalization we should seek and the form of international governance that we should pursue. So according to Roderick, the choices are the following. You can choose to give way to hyper-globalization, restrict democracy, and then you improve the global economic efficiency because you reduce transaction costs. But of course, the cost is equality, social cohesion, human health, and the environment. So obviously, at the end of the day, very few will choose this way. Or you can decide to limit globalization to sustain a degree of democratic governance. It involves things like putting some sand in the wheels of hyper-globalization, and there's a growing literature to explain how to do this. Even the IMF had done this. While I was at the head of the institution, we argued that what has been seen for decades as the devil, namely capital controls, could be useful, providing it's temporary, providing it's well-designed. Sometimes some countries had to react against huge and very disturbing capital inflow that may create asset bubbles and create hyperinflation in the country. And the way to do it, when you have no other way to react immediately, the strongest way to act rapidly was to put in place capital controls. So that's kind of what I have in mind when I say some sand in the wheels of hyperglobalization, because of course this kind of capital control is in opposition with the free movement of capital. But sometimes it may happen to be necessary, and many have been surprised that the IMF, which was seen as the institution, the flagship of this hyperglobalization, could propose things like this. Or, third choice, you can choose to globalize democracy and therefore limit the importance of the nation state and sovereignty, which may be the dream of some, to have only one big state on Earth. But again, this is something that is not going to happen soon. On the contrary, the move these days is more to ask for more national sovereignty and to react more strongly, to attempt to extend the sovereignty to multinational bodies. So probably it's not the direction. The only direction which remains is to refrain deepening the globalization, and even more, to try to back off a little from what has been done. Of course, this idea of globalized democracy sounds utopian, but there are some less ambitious versions that may work. You have international regulatory bodies, for instance, for the banking system or for trade or for things like this, which work. The IMF surveillance is another example of something which is not really a democratic government or something like this, but something which goes in this direction. Same thing for the G20, which has a lot of drawbacks, but is an attempt to have this discussion at the global level to make decisions together. And frankly, when I reflect on the crisis, I consider that unprecedented international policy cooperation is the most important legacy of this crisis. And the G20, especially the one which take place in this country in April 2009, under the leadership of Gordon Brown, was a huge success in terms of, well, they were all sitting around facing the same problem and decided to do what they had to do together, understanding that the moment was not to be a free rider, and that the crisis was big enough and the risks big enough that nobody wanted to play its own game. The leaders were afraid, so they did the right thing. Now they're less afraid, and the momentum for cooperation is on the wane, and not as strong as it was before. But at least 2009, 2010, the beginning of 2010, has shown that really when the leaders, the political leaders of this world, at least those who were in the G20, which were together 26, 27, because G20 always been a bit larger than the 20, they were able, when really facing a problem, to work together. So it's not totally a dream to say that the democracy could work at the global level, even if, not being a dream, it's also not really a reality today. The problem is that even when succeeding, the G20 has been criticized. Why? Because of the lack of democratic legitimacy. Why those countries, not others? And the countries outside the room say, why are we going to follow what they say? Why? We're not in the room. Which is, on one hand, is understandable. On the other hand, you cannot talk with everybody in the room. Same thing for the IMF, where the system is that 187 countries in the world belonging to the IMF are represented by 24 countries around the table. On one hand, there's no way to work differently. On the other hand, the question of legitimacy, how do you choose it? What's the voice, what's representation, how do you vote, how do you make decisions, is a legitimate question. So this question of legitimacy and the way to make decisions together is very important when we look back to the European Union, because that's the most developed attempt to have a system where nation-states together decide to make decisions, not by war, fighting one against the other one, but sitting around the table and trying to find the good solution. It's an attempt to create a space for both democratic and self-determination in a grouping that is big enough to shape globalization in a way no nation states in Europe can do. The problem, of course, is that even if it may be misleading when we look at the way the European Union, and especially the Eurozone, is trying to solve the Greek case, well, it does not portray the system as very effective. And so you say, okay, it's a good attempt to try to have democracy extended beyond the limit of the nation state, but does it work? Not that much. I will come back to this later. Because this leads me to my third trilemma, which regards directly Europe and its governance structure. The first one was Mundell-Fleming, the second was Roderick, the third one comes from a recent paper by Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is heading a research center in Brussels called Bruegel, which is probably one of the best, if not the best, economic research center in Europe. And what does he argue? He says, again, there is fundamental incompatibility between three things: a monetary union, national banking system, and absence of joint responsibility over national public debt. So you have to choose two of the three, but you cannot have national banking system, have monetary union, and no fiscal solidarity. Or, again, you can flip around the three things. And he says this because today we have this, part of the troubles come from the fact that this trilemma is not solved. And that's why it's at the core of the current crisis in Europe. Europeans, not all of them, I remember I'm here in UK, have made the choice of a monetary union, a large number of European countries, which the founding fathers saw as a way to precipitate further political integration. And the European citizens have been reluctant to this, but finally, with a small majority in 1991, with the Maastricht Treaty, they ratified this. Because those who did this, and I was among them, realized that, understood that although this will weaken their national protection and polity inside Europe, it would strengthen Europe's ability to resist to the leveling forces of globalization. So if we go back to Roderick's trilemma, the European citizen who accepted the monetary union accepted to partially depart from national citizenry and pulled their democratic prerogatives above the nation state. So the choice was a compromise, and of course it required a number of accommodations. And as a result of this accommodation, the European current governance structure is very unstable. In particular on this point, that the European, I mean in the Eurozone, when I say European, I mean in the Eurozone, in the monetary union, they accepted that substantial power will be transferred at a higher level than the state, namely the monetary policy and everything around the money, but not all powers. And the question is, where do you exactly put the threshold? Do you transfer enough to make the system work? Especially the fiscal policy remained a national policy, a national prerogative. And you know that in the Lisbon Treaty, the recent Lisbon Treaty, Article 125 is very well known because it's called the infamous non-co-responsibility on public debt, which means practically that countries say we're not responsible from the debt of another country, which on one hand is totally understandable. I mean, why would the German pay for the Belgium or the Italian for the French, or the contrary? But on the other hand, if Pisani is right in his trilemma, then if you don't have this kind of joint responsibility on the fiscal, then you need to have the two other one. What are the two other one? Monetary union, that's not the choice. If you get out, if you dismantle the monetary union, problem is over. If you keep the monetary union, then if you don't accept this joint responsibility on public debt, you need to have this third part, which is to admit not to have national banking system. But today, the banking systems in the European countries, in the Eurozone countries, are still national. What does that mean? That means that, of course, those banks are investing all around the world. But the supervision and the regulation is still national. Practically, it means that when a French bank invests in Latvia, that has been a very real example, and there is a problem. You don't know if it's the home country, France, or the host country, Latvia, regulation and supervision that should work. And because they're not the same, you have conflict. And that has been one of the biggest problems we in the IMF had to face with the Latvian crisis or many other European, Central European countries, where this question of having national system while the banking sector is working across border, this absence of cross-border resolution scheme is obviously something which makes the system not working. So you could choose to have this to avoid joint responsibility on the debt. The problem is that it is very difficult because the way it works is, okay, we have only one supervisory system, one regulation, but then what's the way the crises are solved? They're solved through bankruptcy of banks, country defaults, and a system of resolution of this bankruptcy of banks. From a market point of view, it works. For a social point of view, it's another point. So, at the end of the day, the trilemma can be resolved in three ways. Partial or complete disbanding of the monetary union. I don't think it's going to happen. For political reasons, because it will be very costly for any head of state or government in Europe, especially for the German and the French, to appear as being the liquidator of what has been the European dream. So they will be very reluctant to go that far. That's a political reason. Also for technical reason. As you may know, in the treaty, there is no possibility to get out. You could opt out at the beginning, as the Brits did. But while you're in, you cannot go out. Or you can decide to go out. The Greek, for instance, can decide to go out. But the other cannot kick them out. So if the Greek, for instance, the Greeks decide to leave, fine, they won't. And the recent poll shows they don't want to do that, and we can understand why, because they realize what kind of cost it will imply. And the others, they may want to say, we don't want you, but they don't have a way to do it. So I think it's not going to happen. And on top of that, I think it's not desirable because I think this monetary union can work. But of course, then you have to change the other point. The other point is you choose the centralization of supervision and regulation of the banking system, but then you accept that the solution of crisis will be bank failure with bank run of people and a lot of things that you have experienced here or you were close to experience in these countries with Northern Rock, for instance, and we know how disruptive it may be for the society. Or third thing is, if you want to avoid this kind of instability, then you have to go to some kind of fiscal federalism, even if it's a vague notion and you may have different level of fiscal federalism. At least you need to have something where decisions are made together, but then the responsibility of this kind of decision is shared among the different partners. It's possible to do. When you look at the Greek case, for instance, obviously the Greeks have done a lot of mistakes. But the other Europeans have done a lot of mistakes too, including not supervising enough what the Greeks were doing. So it's just fair to share the cost. And the problem today is that it's not what is being done. The system since the beginning, and when we decided, I was at this time at the head of the IMF, that we tried, it was 2009, tried to, 2010, sorry, tried to May 9, 2010, we will try to help Greece to solve its problem. The idea at the beginning was to have a traditional IMF program, certainly with the help of the Europeans, but shaped, designed as a traditional IMF program, which is we lend you money until you're better off, and then you repay. That's the system, basically. And it takes 3 years, 5 years, but not more. Growth comes back, and then you repay. End of story. The problem is that it appears after 6 months or so that it won't work. It won't work because what was asked to do, the Greek as their part of the effort was not done, including collecting taxes, because it's a country where you don't collect any kind of taxes, and a lot of other things like this. Yeah, you may like it, but it's difficult to have a state working without any kind of taxes, and a long list of other things like this I can elaborate later on if you want. It won't work because one of the tools that should be used for in a case like Greece was a devaluation to restore competitiveness, and because they belong to the monetary union, it was impossible for them to devaluate. And third, last but not least, that when the IMF works with a country, sometimes it fails, sometimes it works, but mostly it works, you have the total control of the economic policy, including the central bank, which was not the case with Greece because the central bank was the ECB, and in no way it was possible for the IMF to have control on the policy of the European Central Bank. So it was a lame system. And rather rapidly, it was clear that it won't work. But then come the real problem. The real problem is, if it doesn't work, then you have to pay the cost, the losses, and start again. It's as if you had a company bankrupt that you want to rebuild. You first pay the losses and start again. It's not what has been done here. And for political reasons, and which I can understand because it's very difficult, all the European leaders try to buy time, not only because they have election, also because it's their natural way of thinking. And they move only when they're at the edge of the cliff. Before they don't move. So the cost of fixing the Greek problem, the Greece GDP is 2% of the Eurozone GDP. It's very small. And that's part of the problem in the markets. Because market people say, how could I be confident in leaders who are unable to fix a problem which is a 2% problem? So the idea that it would be better to pay right after that in a organized way, and then to help the Greek economy to start up again, this idea was put aside because it was too difficult to explain to the French citizen taxpayer, to the German taxpayer and others, that they will pay for the Greece. Fine, but not doing that, the snowball is pushed forward and is increasing. And the cost of that, which had been 1.5 years ago, $100 billion, not nothing, but not that big at the scale of the Eurozone, is now $300 billion, will be in 1 year $500 billion, with no problem solved. Just the dust put under the carpet and the bankrupt or the default avoided for the next time. And then 3 months later, you're still facing the same problem. So, because there's no fiscal union, because nobody but the Greeks are responsible of their own debt, and because all the other countries don't want to step in this kind of fiscal union, there's no solution. But go back to Pisani trilemma. You have the monetary union. If you don't have the fiscal union, then you need to have the supervision and regulation scheme for the banking system. If you don't have it, then you need the fiscal union. You know, in history, there is no example of a monetary union which has worked without fiscal union, period. So you can try to invent something different, but it's very likely it won't work. So let me try to wrap up by showing how these three trilemmas are interrelated. If the Eurozone fails to successfully create a polity that supports a form of pooling of sovereignty above nation states, then I do believe that the hopes for international cooperation in general will vanish as well, because it's the most developed example. And if this most developed example doesn't work, it will be very difficult to convince the other one, unless you're really at the right moment of the crisis, like the G20 in 2009 in London, but that happens very rarely, thanks God. Unless this very special moment, it will be very difficult to convince the other one to work together, because those who have tried have failed. Then, in the event of the Eurozone failure, you will have either hyper-globalization going on, but then this hyper-globalization will crush democracy, or we will experience a substantial deglobalization. But something will happen. The system cannot go on as it is if the Eurozone doesn't succeed. So what the tale I gave you tells us is that unless we abandon our commitment to democracy, and I think nobody here wants to do something like this, or we learn how to convince citizens to go beyond their national sovereignty, but that's not really the situation we're in. On the contrary, we see most of the countries are less inclined to abandon sovereignty for a higher level than they were 10 years ago. So unless we abandon democracy, or we know how to convince people to pull together, then we need to tame globalization, particularly financial globalization. And I think this conclusion is absolutely unavoidable. And the tale teaches us also that it's, let's say, illusory. It's an illusion to dream of a world where international adjustments will be achieved by market forces alone. That was the model. We were blind enough to work as if the model worked, and the model didn't work, and that's why we have this crisis. Most people say the crisis comes from the subprime, as you know, which on one hand is true. That was the beginning of the fire, but I'm convinced that even without the subprime, we would have this debt crisis, because that's more deeply enshrined in the default of the system. So the subprime was just a sparkling, the spark which put the fire everywhere, but it could have been anything else. So if we accept that it's a dream to have market forces adjusting everything with smoothly, then it's useless to argue against countries who have a fixed exchange rate, namely China, while they don't want to open their current account, because that would go back to the first trilemma. The real point for China is not to have the renminbi being flexible. That will be a consequence. The real thing for China is to open the current account and to go in the game of the different nations where they have investment coming from outside, and themselves they invest in the rest of the world. And that's the only way to have an international monetary system which will work, taking really into account what's happening in the field, and not the kind of dream of a theoretical model that doesn't work. And that's why Europe has a very special place in globalization. Not because of its economic size, it's still 25% of global GDP, which is big. The other big part, as you know, is of course the US and Japan, and then the so-called BRICS are very important in terms of population and dynamism, but still small in terms of output. So it's not that much because Europe is, let's say, 1/4 of the global GDP, but because of its original governance experience for the world at large. And that's the point on which I would like to end. There are a lot of technical problems to solve. But, you know, technical problems are not very difficult. You always have technicians to solve them. And especially when you're talking about finance and international finance, the imagination of the guy working in the sector is huge. So that's not the point. The point is the political problem, which is much more challenging. Because the political problem, as I tried to show very rapidly about the Greek case, is to be able to make democratic choices even if you know that the voters in your country will not like it. And to be bold enough to do it. And if you're not, if you just try to avoid the problem, then because of globalization, the problem comes back and you can't solve it and becomes bigger and bigger. So the real problem today for globalization as a whole is, will finally the European model succeed or not? And the very, in my view, very dark and difficult consequences of a collapse of the European model on the rest of the world. And looking at Europe itself, the problem is, will the European countries, whether they are in the Eurozone or not in the Eurozone, be able to understand that there are some contradictions, logical contradictions that you cannot avoid, and again, it leads to some fiscal federalism or to abandon a monetary union. When you say that to an important person like the French president, the German chancellor, or others, they all say, yes, you're right. And then nothing happens. So we're in troubles. We're in troubles, but what we need to keep in mind is that to have an efficient international monetary system, which means rule of the games, which allows everybody to live well, we need to tame globalization, to solve the debt crisis. But for all this, my main point is the following. The challenge is not a technical one. The challenge is really a political and democratic one. And probably the main mistake which has been made by the European founders, and at a small level I have been among them, so I take my part of responsibility, is to believe that when you have a good solution, a kind of technocratic solution, then because it's good, it's enough. And not to understand that the solution is only good if it's also a democratic solution, because at the end of the day, you won't be able to go to the end of the process you put in place, and you end with the result we have today, which is European institutions which are working correctly when you are in shallow waters in a calm situation, and which are just unable to work when you are in a storm. So that's the main lesson of these three trilemmas, is that even when you're dealing with economic question, you cannot forget that the democratic problem has to come first. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to answer questions, if any. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. We will now be taking questions for Mr. Strauss-Kahn. Please note, it is of paramount importance that you wait for a microphone to get to you before you begin to ask your question. Regardless of whether or not we can hear you in here, our members posted throughout the building won't be able to do so unless you wait for the microphone to get to you before you begin. I'll be taking your questions from here, but please address them to Mr. Strauss-Kahn. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your speech. You mostly focused on very developed economies, very developed financial systems. And if we take the example of, for example, Argentina, which arguably was only able to get out of its financial crisis once it discarded IMF policy or IMF advice, do you think there would be advantages or problems in the creation of sort of an alternative IMF for less advanced economies, which can't move in phase with the developed financial systems that we just mentioned? Thank you.
Your question is very interesting. When I came to the IMF in 2007, many of my friends and non-friends told me, what are you going to do there? This institution works only with emerging countries and developing countries. It's not interesting. Because at this time, the idea was that developed economies, advanced economies, we know how to manage, no problem. So institution like the IMF was only useful for emerging countries. The reality of this last year has shown this was totally wrong. So now back to your question. No, I think the IMF is equipped to work with emerging countries and low-income countries, especially in Africa, despite the fact that the Argentina policy was a disaster and has to be recognized as a disaster. I mean, it's not surprising that an institution composed of human beings may make mistakes, even if those mistakes are very costly for the population. So obviously, the policy which has been put in place at this time for many reasons, including the pressure of the United States, was not appropriate. True also to say that Argentina solved its problem putting aside the IMF solution, but it cost them 10 years to go back on markets, and it's still not totally done. So it has advantages and drawbacks to get out of the international system. But it's true to say that what the IMF recipe was not good at this time. That's absolutely true. It doesn't mean that it's wrong everywhere, anytime. And I have a lot of other examples where the IMF program worked well, and finally the country, not without pain, it's always painful. When you have a fire, you need to get rid of the fire, but it doesn't mean that there's no cost. Of course there's a cost. But there are a lot of examples that I can give you of African countries, Latin American countries, including Brazil, where the policies which have been put in place worked well. It's not always the case.
Mr. Strauss-Kahn, sorry, thank you very much for your remarks. I have a question. What would be your vision for the IMF for the 21st century, especially with its role as a lender of last resort, but also as a financial stabilizer? Because given the political nature of the IMF, it's sometimes very, very hard for the IMF to control the financial systems in the developed economies like the US, sort of blocking it. Thank you very much.
Well, as you may have understood with the few words I said before, I'm definitely optimistic, and I believe that there's a way, which will take time, for multilateral organization to be more powerful and try to help the global economy to work better. So I think we shouldn't fight against multilateral organization, but we have to change their policy when they're not good. For instance, talking about WTO, I always have been against those saying we have to destroy WTO. We may say the rules of the WTO is not good because they don't help developing countries and we have to change those rules, but those kind of organizations trying to put in place a regulation of the system are good organizations. And in my view, the most powerful there will be, the better it is. The question is the legitimacy of the decision they make, and that's the point you were mentioning. And that's right, that it makes sense that in one way or another, because it's financial institution, the different countries will be represented by a voting power which is directly linked to their economic weight, whatever the way you measure this economic weight. If not, you cannot make any decision. But on the other hand, the role of some countries, namely the United States, but not only, is very dominant and sometimes make it impossible to do the job. Let me give you just one example. There's one program of the IMF which is called FSAP. FSAP stands for Financial Assessment Sector Program. So it is a system where, on a voluntary basis, because it's not in the treaty, the Bretton Woods Treaty, it's much more modern. On a voluntary basis, a country accepts the IMF to come and check the health of the financial sector. For a country like UK, it's 40 to 50 people for 1 year. It's a very important work. It's voluntary because we have no way to make it compulsory, for the reason I said, because it's not in the treaty. And almost all big countries, also some small countries, but almost all big countries, year after year, accepted the idea that it was useful for them to have this kind of assessment. But two, China and the US. So I'm not arguing that if the FSAP would have existed before in the US, we would have avoided the subprime crisis. It would be very pretentious to say that the IMF would have seen everything and solved the problem. But without going to look what's going on, without checking, of course you can find the problem. Now, because of the crisis, both China and the US have accepted to have this FSAP, and the Chinese FSAP is just over now, and very interesting and very useful for the Chinese because they have a lot of problem in the financial sector. So, at the end of the day, I think that the role of institutions like the IMF, not only as a lender of last resort, but also as the body likely to have some surveillance on what's going on. And you need surveillance because in an interconnected economy, what happens to country X has a kind of consequences on country Y. And so you need to know what's going on. This role has to be enhanced. But one condition is absolutely necessary, which is to have a more democratic way of making decisions, which means a better representation of emerging countries, which means more diversified staff in terms of national diversity, but not only national diversity, but also cultural diversity, and to have an institution that's really an institution which plays its role at the service of the global economy. You know, when the founding fathers of the IMF, Keynes and the Secretary of the Treasury, White, in 1944 in Bretton Woods, wrote the status and the treaty for the IMF, the idea was very simple. It was, we went to World War II mostly, not only, but mostly because of economic problems and economic crisis. If we want to work for peace, we need to have the UN. That was the same time where the UN has been put in place. We need a lot of things, but we need also organization that will try to avoid, maybe not always succeed, but to avoid crisis, and when they can't avoid a crisis, to repair and fix the problem. And so the creation of an institution like the IMF is directly linked to the ideal of peace and helping countries to avoid war originated in economic problems. So the need of this institution for me is absolutely obvious. The strength of the institution is today not big enough, but it will be even worse to increase the strength without giving more democratic governance to the system. So it has to go both ways, and I think that Asian countries, for instance, Latin American countries too, are ready to play the game and follow the rules if they recognize at their normal size then you may argue during hours what is really the size and the power of a country. That's a very technical discussion I'm not going to elaborate on. But whatever the index you take, it's obvious that still now, even if two reforms took place, one in 2008, one in 2011, where the share, the voice, the representation of emerging countries has been pushed up, even now there's still an overrepresentation, namely of European countries, because of historical reason, and the Europeans have to admit it. And they will be good player and play finally for their own interest in accepting this idea that rather than resisting until the last possible day to let China, India, Brazil, other countries to have more voice, they should accept this because that's the way for the institution to work well.
Perhaps from the gallery. Yes, in the pink.
I'd like to ask a question about France and what you think the priorities for the French economy should be and which of the presidential candidates are the best suited to meet them. Thank you.
I guess you have the answer to the second part of your question already. Well, the French problem is, on one hand, the same as the other European countries' problem. Solve the debt crisis, having growth coming back, and growth will not come back unless the debt crisis is solved, and the debt crisis will not solve unless you really decided to write off a large part of it. An effort has been done just today called PSI, private sector involvement, where part of the private debt has been write off, which is a good step forward, but still there's a public debt which is still huge, and the official sector has to do the same to be able, for European countries to be able to recover. So the problem from this point of view is the same as others. You may have seen the forecast made by many institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD and others. Growth will be very low, including for UK in this year, because we're all interconnected within or outside of the Eurozone. And the main problem is this one, with all his consequences in terms of unemployment, inequalities, poverty, and so on. But France has also some specific problem. One is that the debt level is not as big as Italy or Spain, not talking about Greece or Portugal, but still too high. Still too high compared to other countries like Germany, like the Netherlands, Sweden. So a special effort has to be done on this, and a special fight has to be made on this. Not only for, I like to say this, not only for technical, financial reasons that everybody can understand, but also for justice. When you're in debt, you pay interest. You pay, where does the money come from? The money comes from the tax revenue. Where does the money go? The money goes to those who had land to the country. Who lends? Well, people who have money. Who pay the taxes? Everybody. So, a kind of a caricature, but it's true, is that the guy who goes to the supermarket, buy a dozen of eggs, pay VAT. This VAT, part of this VAT, will be used to repay interest to people having a lot of money. So the debt system is a fantastic anti-redistribution system. So also for justice reason, you need to have a lower debt, not only for traditional financial reasons. So that's one of the specific problems of France. Again, not as big as some other countries, but big enough. And the other one, in my view, is all the system around the education system, research system, innovation. My country used to be a very innovative country, and for many reasons, I feel the system doesn't work anymore. So it has consequences on competitiveness, and then it has consequences on growth potential, and the problem begins. So short-term problem, there's a long list, but main short-term problem, public deficit, main medium-term problem, innovation, research, education. Now to the second part of your question. I haven't seen exactly who were the candidates, so it's very difficult for me to make a choice. No, there are two main candidates. I don't think, even it has been discussed a few months ago, but I think now it's impossible that any other one will be able to come to the second round. As you may know, maybe not all of you, we have a system in 2 rounds. First round, everybody can be a candidate, and the 2 winners of the first round go to the second round. Now I think it's obvious that the 2 guys going to the second round will be Nicolas Sarkozy and François Hollande, one from the center-right, the other from the center-left. Polls are polls. They're not always accurate. They're very much in favor of François Hollande, with a huge margin, bigger than ever seen in French election. I don't believe that it will end that way. It will certainly be reduced, the margin, but I think that François Hollande will be elected, mainly because Nicolas Sarkozy, the most French citizens are disappointed, including people from the center and some of the right, his own voters, disappointed from the way he managed his 5 years of tenure. So, again, election is election, until the last voter has voted, you don't know. But if I had to bet, I probably, certainly, will bet on Hollande, unless I'm a good financial man, and I will hedge in voting for Sarkozy, so either Hollande wins and I'm happy, or I make money.
Another question, please. Yes, sir.
Mr. Strauss-Kahn, I would like to speak on your last trilemma between monetary union, national banking systems, and a lack of responsibility for others' debt. I believe you stated that you still believe that the monetary union can work. So which of the other two, a national banking system or a lack of responsibility for others' debt, do you think is the best way forward for the European Union? And do you think that there is the political will to establish either of those two, or to get rid of either of those two systems?
Yeah, that's the point. I think that as soon as you decided to keep the monetary union, as you correctly said, you have to accept one of the 2 others. And in my view, it's much better to accept to pool fiscal resources, at least at the lower level, to be co-responsible of public debt, than to go the other way, which is to keep sovereignty on your public debt, no co-responsibility, but then to be obliged to accept the question of regulation by the banking system. Because, as I said, this regulation by the banking system on the paper works, and probably the reality may work too, but the social cost is huge. It's very disruptive. It goes through sovereign defaults, bankrupt of banks, and then the resolution system which solves this question, but it has a lot of consequences on the stability. So the other system, in my view, some kind of fiscal integration, is much smoother, much more stable, and for me, it's by far the best solution. Now, is it likely to happen? Well, it's always the same question. Either the trilemma is wrong, maybe, but I think it's true, or you have to choose. There is no other option. Non-choice is the worst situation. So either the European decided to have this kind of huge supervision of the banking sector in Europe and so on, they won't decide that, or they have to follow this road and to accept it, rather than postpone and postpone, to accept to have this co-responsibility on public debt. One way to do it is very well known, but it's just techniques, is the so-called Eurobonds. You have other way to do it, different technical system, I don't care. The problem is the political decision to say, okay, we need, if we want to keep the monetary union, we need to have a certain degree of fiscal integration. When I was a finance minister of my country back 98, 99, I made a proposal. I've been killed for this. I've been killed many times since, but that of course, it has to go step by step. It was 14 years ago. That my proposal was, starting with the German, that I won't present the budget to the French Parliament before I go in front of the standing committee, finance standing committee in the Bundestag, to show what we want to do and to get their critics, and the other way around. They won't go with the budget in the Bundestag before coming to the Finance Commission in Paris. I'll let you imagine. But that's the way to start this kind of integration, knowing what the others are really going to do. Not only in Brussels, in formal meetings, very technocratic meetings, where you say what you want and you do the contrary, but really working together. Or you get rid of the monetary union, but I don't think it's the right way to do things, because even the German, who believe they don't benefit so much from the monetary union, benefit a lot, a lot. The value of the Deutschmark, if we had still a Deutschmark, will be much higher than the euro today, and their competitiveness, of course, will not be the competitiveness they have. They must accept this, and they do when you talk with them. They're not idiots. Of course, they know that. So everybody has a lot of advantages of the monetary union, but also some drawbacks, which is just normal. So there's nothing, there's no free lunch. You cannot have a system with only advantages. So there are some drawbacks. The question is to try to minimize the drawbacks and to benefit from the advantages. And at the point we reach now, the main drawback is this huge amount of debt which has been accumulated without any kind of control, Greece, Portugal, and to fix this. And the way to fix it, back to what I say, is in one way or another, many technical way to do it, to accept this kind of fiscal, I'd say the bad word, fiscal federalism.
Perhaps a last couple of questions. Any other? Yes. Oh, sorry, just in front of you. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have to ask, what do you think of the protests outside, please?
You're a counter of freedom. They can do what they want. I think they're wrong.
Another question. Yes, sir. In the green, there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strauss-Kahn. You mentioned that you think that there's sort of an inherent flaw in the European project and that it's privileged this technocratic approach to any concern for democracy whatsoever. And I'm curious if you think that there's any possible way of salvaging it. Because I agree with you. I think that, I'm in favor of some sort of a pan-European project, but I feel like at this point is not that idea just so damaged because those technocrats who've been in charge of the European integration process have not made any effort at making the case to the public. So I'm curious how you think that this can be overcome, or if it can at all.
Yeah, it's very difficult. You're absolutely right. It's very difficult. When you talk, well, now they're unfortunately all dead, but when 20 years ago, even sometime earlier, you could talk with some old founding fathers of the story in the 50s, when all the story began between the French and the German first, with the community of steel and coke, as you may remember, and Euratom on the nuclear energy and all these kind of things to begin to work together. They say that it was so close to the war, it was 10 years, 15 years after the war, that it would have been impossible to do it in a democratic way. And that it has only been possible to do because government decided together and without any kind of democratic control, de facto. So, I'm not saying it's good, but they're probably right. I was a kid at this time, I just don't know, but they're probably right when I say it would have been impossible to build anything if we had to go to a referendum or whatever every day. Good. The question is, afterwards, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the system went on in the same way. And that was, I think the mistake. Because at one point in time, and that's of course very good, the man in the streets wants to know exactly what's going on. And you cannot say, well, it's too complicated for you, you don't understand. And that, I mean, that's exactly the contrary of democracy. The role of politicians is to explain and not to shy away because it's too difficult. So I think, for instance, François Mitterrand, from this point of view, I have points on which I disagree, but was very good and correct in engaging in the Maastricht Treaty because he believed it was a good thing, fine. And he fought a lot, explaining and explaining and explaining, and he put his own political survival at risk with the Maastricht Treaty, which finally he won by a small margin. That's the role of politicians. They have to take this kind of risk. And unfortunately, it hasn't been done a lot during the last 20 years, and so I can absolutely understand, even if I'm very sorry about that, that in Germany, in France, not talking about the Brits, people are very reluctant to this kind of technocratic monster which is in Brussels. To be fair, we must also say that it has been a kind of a easy way for governance. And I'm not sure that I avoid it totally myself. When you have a problem being in the government, to say, oh, it's not my fault, it's Brussels. So, of course, if everything which goes wrong is always Brussels, not surprised that people at the end don't like Brussels. So, this way of doing things doesn't help. And you know, well, we're all human, we will make mistakes, so everybody did that. But basically, today, the European, or the willingness of people to go further in political integration is very low, or lower than it has been in the past. And that's a pity, because I'm convinced that it's the only way for the European people, not tomorrow morning, but in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, to remain independent. Independent meaning that if we're not able to build Europe with all the democracy that is needed, and that doesn't exist today, then, you know, in my country, in classroom for kids, you have big maps, probably in your country too, you know, world map, and, with all the countries in different colors and so on. And what I think is that in 5 decades from now, 50 years, something like that, our kids or grandkids, well, my grandkids and your kids, will have probably not a map, but a screen or something like this. And then the teacher will say, look, we have 5 big grouping. The Chinese one here, and the American one here, which will go from Canada to some part of Central America. Probably the South American one around Brazil here. Maybe something in Africa, maybe not, that's a big question mark. And the question is, will the teacher say, that's Europe? I'm not sure. I hope so, because it's my culture. But I'm not sure. There is a possibility that the dismantling of all this make all these countries kind of a dependency of one big pole, which will remain, which is the American pole. And I'm not, absolutely not anti-American. I mean, it's a possible choice. And you may be happy as being a province, a far province of the American empire. But you may also want something different. And if you want something different, then you need to build Europe. So we have no other choice. And to do it, all what could be done by tricks, avoiding popular consentment, is over. So now we have to face democracy, which means clearly that politicians has to go in the street, in the schools, talk with the people and explain and explain and explain again. Either they're wrong and they can't explain, then it's wrong. Fine. It's better not to do it. Or they're right, and I think they're right, and then they have to explain it through the democratic way.
I will come back to you, so gentleman in the check shirt.
Hello. I was wondering if you could explain why Diallo had vaginal bruising after the day that you met her.
I'm not sure I understand your question. What do you want me to explain? No, please, no, let him hear. Can you just tell me exactly what your question is?
The attorney of Diallo spoke today.
Yes.
And talked about the vaginal bruising that she had after you met. And I was just wondering why you think that is the case.
Well, I'm not quite sure that it's the topic of this evening, but there's no reason not to answer you. The district attorney in New York is the prosecutor, and he decided to dismiss the case because he says the lady was lying. That's it. Now, the attorney may say what he wants. The reality is that I spent a week in prison after the declaration of a woman, that there has been a prosecution, and frankly, they haven't been very nice with me, so they didn't want to be nice with me, but that's okay. And after one and a half months, the district attorney wrote to me saying, I'm sorry, we were wrong. And it took another month to have the paperwork, and he dismissed the charges. So, what do you want?
I will take one final question, please. There's quite a few upstairs. Oh my God, there's loads upstairs. Yes, sir.
Oh, I can't see you.
Yes, in the brown. Okay.
I just wondered, what was your opinion of David Cameron's veto of the EU Fiscal Reform Pact in December, and can the EU as a whole survive if the Eurozone accepts fiscal federalism? Can the EU as a whole survive without countries like the UK, perhaps through a referendum, choosing to leave entirely?
Whether or not the Union can survive if UK decided to get out, I don't know. However, it won't be really a European Union. It's impossible to have a European Union without UK. So, something may survive. It may be called a European Union, but it will be very weak and will not fulfill the goal I was describing before, to build something which may help shaping globalization and provide some special culture in this melting pot. So formally it may survive. Practically it makes no sense for me. Now, to your question on Cameron veto, I think that's more domestic policy than a real choice. And since then, there have been some explanation, I won't say back off, but explanation on this. So that's part of the problem, that each and every European leader, French, German, British, has to deal with the real problem he's facing in the European Council and his own public opinion. And for some reason, at some point in time, he may have put more weight on what he says and how it will be understood by his own public opinion than on the problem he has to solve. It happens to everybody. And that's part of the problem of the system, which is just in between, and as I said at the beginning, unstable, where the decision-making process at the center is not independent from what happens in the different countries. And this cannot work very well, and that's a good example of it. But there's many others where Cameron were not involved and others were involved for the same kind of reasons.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions, and a final thank you to Mr. Strauss-Kahn. Have a good week, and we hope to see you soon.